Hey guys, tonight we head back to the Middle Ages, where you're not curled up under a duvet, but instead tramping down a rutted dirt road somewhere between Normandy and nowhere, your feet blistered, your pack soaked through, and the sound of distant church bells barely audible over your stomach growling for something that isn't dry bread and onion. You're a pilgrim, and this is your life now. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, especially if it's some unholy hour and you should have been asleep 3 snacks ago. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down the road, hood low against the misty drizzle, the smell of wet wool lingering around you like a damp sheep. It's the kind of weather that squelches into your boots and never quite leaves. The year is something like 1300. Nobody's counting that closely, and you're one of tens of thousands of souls walking these same muddy roads across Europe. Not for glory, not for gold, for God, but also, maybe, for redemption, or for the chance to gossip at taverns, or just to escape your cousin's 4th wedding. Reasons varied, but whatever your personal excuse, you're headed to a holy shrine. And tonight, you're dreaming of Santiago de Compostela, the Spanish town at the end of the earth where, they say, St. James the Greater lies buried, beneath incense-scented stones and enough relics to fill a papal gift shop. Every morning you wake stiff on a haymat in some barn or roadside abbey, stretch your aching limbs, and head west. You carry little: a walking stick, a coarse cloak, maybe a water skin that leaks exactly when it shouldn't, and pinned to your chest, or tied to your belt with a fraying leather cord, is a seashell. Not just any seashell, a scallop, white, curved like a fan. It catches the morning sun like a modest medal of valor, a badge that marks you as a pilgrim, one of the weary faithful. Now, here's where it gets weird. You are nowhere near the sea. The coast is hundreds of miles behind you, if you even started there, but the shell stays with you. Everyone on this road has one, or wants one, or is willing to pretend they've been to Santiago just to buy one cheap from that guy with suspiciously clean sandals near the monastery steps. You see, in medieval Europe, your clothing talked. And that little scallop shell on your cloak, it shouted something big. I've been to the end of the world and back. I walked. I prayed. I survived dysentery. Respect me. This trail isn't paved, of course. It's a mash of pebbles, brambles, cow dung, and the occasional cart rut deep enough to sprain a monk. Your boots, if you even have them, rub your heels raw, and there's always that one guy ahead of you who insists on singing psalms off-key, just loud enough to ruin the silence, but not loud enough to identify and throttle. But you're not alone. Every bend in the road reveals more cloaked shapes, pilgrim hats flopping in the wind, voices muttering in Latin and Flemish and some unholy French German dialect that even the angels can't decipher, and every so often someone passes you wearing the same shell. There's a nod, a silent communion. You both know the pain of walking through rain-soaked alfalfa fields in sandals held together by sheer will and sheep gut. Now, quick detour. Mainstream fact time. During the high Middle Ages, pilgrimages were the thing to do. Everyone, from peasants to nobles, made the trek to shrines like Santiago, Canterbury, and Rome. Entire guidebooks were written. Imagine Yelp reviews for abbeys and sausage stands, and pilgrims could collect letters of recommendation to gain safe passage and free lodging. But, fringe tidbit, coming in hot, some pilgrims didn't even make the journey for religious reasons. Some were sentenced to go. Court-ordered holiness, if you will. Commit a crime? You might be ordered to walk 1,000 miles barefoot to atone, which is probably why that guy muttering behind you is clutching a scallop shell and a court document. And here's your first scholarly argument of the night. Historians still argue whether medieval people really believed they had to physically go to a shrine to get divine brownie points, or whether the church just leaned hard into travel as mercy because it kept troublesome folks far from town for a few months. You know, less sin per square mile. You pass a crumbling stone cross at a fork in the road. There's a pile of little tokens at its base, pebbles, carved wooden hearts, one incredibly sad-looking stuffed bird made of twine. Pilgrims leave things behind here. Burdens, sins, flatulence, probably. Your feet hurt, your stomach whines. But ahead, on the horizon, is a flicker of smoke curling up from a village chimney. Shelter, maybe a warm broth. Maybe a monk who won't ask too many questions. And maybe, just maybe, a proper place to sleep where your blanket doesn't also host a family of mice. But before you drift off, staring at the scallop shell hanging from your belt, you wonder, why this shell? What does it mean? Why is it everywhere? And why, when you finally get to Santiago, will you see 1,000 more of them carved into the very stones? You'll find out, but first, you'll need to make it through this next stretch of muddy fields, questionable cheese, and way too many stories about St. James and his alleged teleporting coffin. You lean on your walking stick, shifting your weight to the foot that hurts marginally less. It's been raining again, and the road behind you is a glistening ribbon of churned mud and hoof prints. The scallop shell tied to your belt swings as you move, clicking softly like a tiny, determined metronome. You didn't always know what it meant. Not really. When you first heard of it, maybe from that bearded man in your village who said he once saw St. James's tomb and got better knees from it, it was just another token of a distant holy world. But now, as the grime creeps up your calves and your rations run low, that shell has started to feel like more than decoration. It's a story. And the story doesn't even start with St. James. The scallop shell had power long before Christianity rolled into town. Back when Romans still ruled these roads and pagans danced around trees more than they attended Mass, the sea was its own kind of cathedral. The scallop's shape, open, curved, with radiating lines, was seen as a symbol of fertility, rebirth, and, oddly enough, the goddess Venus. That's right, long before pilgrims sewed it onto their cloaks, the shell was connected to love, not penance. Imagine explaining that to the bishop. There were feasts by the coast, think medieval beach parties but with worse hygiene, where people would eat shellfish, make offerings, and celebrate renewal. Some even wore scallop shells as amulets, believing they protected sailors and travelers from getting lost or dragged into the deep. You start to think maybe that bearded guy wasn't entirely wrong about the knees. Fast forward a few centuries, and Christianity does what it often does. It absorbs. Instead of banning the shell entirely, it rebranded it. Suddenly, that same shell is a marker of piety, a souvenir of sainthood, a logo for the holiest road west. You tug your cloak tighter. The wind carries the scent of salt, not from the sea, but from a nearby salt works you've been walking past for the better part of an hour. Your mind drifts to the first time you ever saw someone wearing the scallop shell. It was years ago, at the village fair. He was limping, sun-darkened, speaking Spanish with the local priest in hushed tones. Kids gathered around him, eyes wide. He held up the shell like a trophy, and you swore it gleamed unnaturally in the sun. He said the shell protected him. From what? He didn't say. Wolves, bandits, syphilis, who knows? But what he did say stuck. The shell shows you made it. And even then, people weren't always sure what that meant. Because, and here's tonight's debate to chew on, historians still argue whether the shell was originally handed out at Santiago to prove you'd reached the tomb, or whether pilgrims were supposed to find one on the beach nearby, then carry it home like a badge of honor. If it was the latter, that was pretty inconvenient. The beach was still several kilometers from the shrine. Imagine reaching the holy site, falling to your knees in prayer, then someone says, "Right, now just pop down to the coast and grab a shell, or nobody'll believe you." Still, it became a ritual, a rite, a token that told others loudly and proudly you had done the thing. It didn't matter whether you'd been robbed in Pamplona or fallen in a bog near Burgos. If you had the shell, you'd earned your place in tavern stories and maybe even a little respect back home. But just as the shell gained meaning, it also gained copycats. Because, light joke coming in, if there's one universal truth in history, it's this. Where there's a market for souvenirs, there's someone selling knockoffs. And medieval people were terrible at subtlety. If someone smelled like the road and wore a shell, they were probably legit. If someone smelled like lavender and had 3 shiny shells and 0 dust on their shoes, no. The church tried to crack down on it. They created rules about who could sell the shells. In some places, they restricted distribution to monks or guilds, who were basically the medieval version of brand managers. But that didn't stop everyone. Seashell bootlegging became a thing, yes. Actual scallop shell fraud. You once saw a man nearly get kicked out of an abbey for carrying a shell made of lead. It was shiny. It was heavy. It was, frankly, ridiculous, but he swore he'd earned it. The abbot rolled his eyes so hard you worried they'd never come back down. As you walk, you finger your own shell. It's cracked slightly at the edge, earned during a fall on some cursed gravel path outside Poitiers. But it's yours, real. And even if you're not entirely sure where it came from originally, you're starting to understand what it represents. It's more than a keepsake. It's shorthand for an entire lived experience, a code word, a key to enter certain places and conversations. You flash it at a monastery gate, and suddenly there's food, warmth, even dry socks if the friar likes you enough. And yes, it's also a bit of a flex. You've been places, seen things, survived spoiled milk and theological arguments. That shell says, I'm not just some yokel who's never left home. I've journeyed, I've wept, I've vomited in 3 languages. A cart rolls by, pulled by a donkey that looks more world-weary than you. The driver, a woman with sharp eyes and dirt on her chin, nods once. You nod back. Her shell's tied to the cart's frame with a frayed ribbon. No words, no need. The shell does all the talking. So you keep walking, 1 foot in front of the other, the shell bouncing at your side. And somewhere behind you, in the puddle-filled distance, you know someone else is seeing your shell and wondering what story it tells. The path grows narrower now, flanked by crumbling stone walls stitched together with moss. You step carefully over puddles, the kind that look shallow but secretly aspire to swallow your ankle. The scallop shell at your side taps lightly against your belt, your ever-present travel companion, like a clumsy guardian angel. Up ahead, two pilgrims are arguing about directions. One swears that west is toward the sun. Never mind that it's hidden behind an unhelpfully eternal gray sky. The other insists she remembers that tree from 3 days ago. It's hard to tell which is more unreliable, the medieval sense of direction or medieval memory. You skirt around them quietly because you know where you're going, west towards Santiago, or more precisely, toward the tomb of St. James the Greater, or at least someone they say is St. James. That's a whole other mess, but you don't have time to doubt. Pilgrims rarely do. Doubt gets you cold and eaten by wolves. Now here's your mainstream fact. The Camino de Santiago, Way of St. James, became one of the 3 great pilgrimage routes of the medieval Christian world, alongside the paths to Rome and Jerusalem. By the 12th century, it had exploded in popularity. Entire towns thrived because pilgrims passed through. Inns popped up, churches stretched their arms wider to receive the faithful and their coin purses, and a handful of well-timed miracles made sure everyone stayed very interested in getting there. You don't know it yet, but you're part of an ancient tide of human movement that reshaped Yorba's roads. You're sleeping in spaces built just for travelers like you, some noble, some downright rat-infested, and you're speaking with people you would have never met if not for this shared obsession with one dusty tomb in northwest Spain. But it wasn't always like this. The road had a beginning. Back in the 9th century, legend says that a hermit named Pelayo was guided by a strange light in the sky, stars swirling over a forgotten field in Galicia. He followed them and discovered a tomb. Inside, a body clad in robes with signs, miraculous signs, that this was none other than James the Apostle. That's right, one of the 12. The James who preached, traveled, and allegedly got beheaded in Jerusalem. Love James. Of course, there's just one teensy, inconvenient detail. There's no record of how he got from the Holy Land to northern Spain. Like, none. This is where it gets suspiciously theatrical. Enter the myth. After his execution, James's disciples stole his body, placed it in a stone boat, and pushed it out to sea. With no sail, no oars. Just vibes and divine GPS. The boat somehow made its way across the entire Mediterranean, swung around the Iberian coast, and gently beached itself in Galicia, as one does. The body was then buried and promptly forgotten until the glow-in-the-dark angel show brought Pelayo sniffing around. Historians still argue whether this discovery was a sincere miracle or a masterstroke of medieval marketing. Some point out that Spain, freshly trying to re-Christianize itself during the Reconquista, really benefited from having a major apostolic shrine to attract pilgrims and prestige. Others argue, more generously, that the faithful wanted to believe, and belief, in the end, built cathedrals. You probably don't care about the politics. You just want to get there, to Santiago. And despite the blisters, despite the side eye from that goose you just passed, you swear you judged you feel the pull, not just to the tomb, but to the experience. The path is the point. Along the way, shrines dot the roadside like breadcrumbs. You stop at one, just a small stone niche with a faded statue and a bowl of holy water. Someone's left a crust of bread and a seashell beside it. You add a pebble from your pocket, And this is where the shell starts to deepen in meaning. You've probably heard by now that its grooves, those radiating lines, symbolize the many routes of the pilgrimage, all leading to one sacred center. Just like pilgrims from every kingdom and cowpath eventually find their way to Santiago. It's poetic. It's also wildly impractical if you try to trace actual maps. But it works, it sticks. So the shell becomes a symbol, not just of having reached Santiago, but of being on the journey at all. And in a medieval world where most people never left their village, being on pilgrimage made you someone else. Someone brave. Someone touched by something greater than routine and taxes and goats. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. There were plenty of skeptics, some in the church, some in taverns, who thought pilgrimages were more excuse than exercise. Sure, go to Santiago, they'd say, but don't expect St. James to clean your sins and your feet. Still, the movement grew. Pilgrimage routes became arteries of culture. Ideas, songs, recipes, and diseases all traveled with the pilgrims. That's right, your itchy rash probably wasn't divine punishment. More likely it came from sharing soup with a Flemish guy who hadn't washed his hands since Avignon. You pass through a tiny hamlet now. Chickens scatter. A child points at your shell and whispers something to his grandmother. She nods solemnly, makes the sign of the cross, and hands you a small hunk of cheese. That's the magic of the shell. It marks you as someone on a sacred mission. People feed you, shelter you. Sometimes they rob you too, but hey, nothing's perfect. As dusk settles, you find a wayside cross and collapse beside it. You share a meal with two Breton pilgrims, one of whom insists on singing the same 4 lines of a hymn between bites. You don't mind. It's starting to feel like home, this road. This discomfort, this strange family of wanderers held together by shared aches and shared hopes. You pull your shell from your belt and trace its ridges with a tired thumb. Every line leads to the center. Every road the promise of redemption. Or at least a decent meal at the next abbey. Somewhere, just beyond the stars, a stone boat still floats. You wake with a start, damp, cold, and alarmed by a cow that has mistaken your sleeping form for grass. It snorts, unimpressed, and wanders off into the dawn mist. You sit up, stretch, and wince as your spine makes an unpleasant cracking sound that could double as a warning bell. The scallop shell hanging from your belt flutters in the breeze, and you remember, oh, right, you're a pilgrim. Again, you brush hay from your hair and resume your march down the dirt road. A nearby signpost points vaguely west, with a carved shell symbol etched into the wood. You're getting closer to Santiago. You can feel it in your bones. But as you trudge past yet another sleepy village with chickens strutting like they own the place, you begin to notice something odd. There are more shells than there should be, not just on cloaks and bags, but in baskets for sale, nailed to doors, even decorating the rims of cheap wooden mugs. And not all of them are, well, real. You stop at a roadside stall where a merchant is hawking trinkets. He flashes a smile so greasy it could oil a cartwheel. "Pilgrim, fresh from Santiago these are, blessed, holy, hand-collected by monks," he crows, gesturing toward a pile of shells that, if you're being honest, look suspiciously pristine and entirely mass-produced. One of them even has "Best Dad in Santiago" painted on it in shaky red ink. You raise an eyebrow. The merchant raises the price. Here's your mainstream fact. By the 12th and 13th centuries, so many people were walking the Camino that selling scallop shells became a booming industry. Officially, Shells were supposed to be gathered from the Galician coast near Santiago as a reward for completing the pilgrimage. In practice, not everyone wanted to wait until they'd arrived. Some couldn't even make it to the shrine. Others, well, let's just say creative shortcuts existed. Enter the scallop shell black market. Astonishingly, it became such a problem that the church had to step in. Santiago's religious authorities established rules. Only designated shops approved by the cathedral could sell scallop shells. These official vendors were often monks or lay people working under church oversight. Think of it as medieval licensing. And yes, there were fines for fakes. But even with the regulation, the knockoffs spread. Lead shells, tin shells, clay imitations. Some merchants even cut wooden shells and painted grooves on them. One enterprising man in Leon was known to carve shells from soapstone, attractive until they crumbled in the rain, which is unfortunate for a journey defined by constant rain. Now comes your quirky fringe tidbit. Not all of these shells were just badges. Some were, brace yourself, magical currency. That's right. In some regions, carrying a scallop shell was believed to grant safe passage, not just through roads, but through death. People placed them in graves, hoping that St. James would recognize them and escort them to paradise, like a divine bouncer checking IDs at the pearly gates. And that's where the scams really hit home. Because if a shell could save your soul, then buying a fake one was not just a tourist trap, it was eternal fraud. One poor soul was buried with a shell made from bark. It rotted in a week. Whether that person made it to heaven is debatable. Historians still argue whether people truly believed the shell held intrinsic spiritual power or whether it was symbolic, like a wedding ring or a really well-written resume. Back on the road, you pass a group of pilgrims crowded around a friar with a very small table. He's inspecting shells like a customs officer. One by one, he checks the ridges, the weight, the shine. He gives a nod or a frown, then stamps a parchment with a red wax seal. You peer closer and realize this is real. The friar's a cathedral-appointed inspector. And those seals? Proof that your shell is legit. You clench your own shell in your palm. Is it real? You didn't buy it. A kind woman gave it to you after you helped her husband out of a muddy ditch. But where she got it, who knows? You're beginning to understand that the story behind the shell is just as important as the shell itself. You remember a story you heard at an inn. A pilgrim who had never left his village, bedridden with illness, asked his nephew to make the journey in his name. The nephew made it to Santiago, prayed, bought a shell, and brought it home. When the older man died, he was buried with that shell, as though his soul had walked every mile. Some said St. James appeared in the village a week later and gave a blessing. Others said it was a prankster monk with stage makeup. Still, you wonder, could someone else carry your sins for you? Could a shell bought by another still buy you grace? This is the medieval spiritual economy at its finest. Part belief, part bureaucracy, part drama. And you're walking straight through it in muddy boots. You cross a narrow stone bridge, the kind with no rails and exactly enough moss to suggest someone definitely fell off last week. On the other side, a beggar sits with a wooden bowl and a torn cloak. He doesn't speak, but the scallop shell at his feet tells you everything. He's walked this road. He's one of you. You nod, drop a coin into his bowl, and keep walking. The shell did all the talking again. The sun sets in watercolor strokes across the sky. Orange, violet, bruised blue. You find shelter in a pilgrim hospice run by nuns who smell of herbs and occasional disapproval. They feed you stew. Your bunk is a wooden slab, luxury. As you drift off, you hear one of the nuns scolding a fellow traveler for buying his shell in Toledo. You earn the shell, she says. You don't purchase the miracle. You roll over, one hand on the curve of your own shell, and wonder how many miracles are bought, how many are borrowed, and how many are just bits of sea debris strung up with string and hope. Tomorrow you walk again, but tonight your shell is enough. You leave the hospice just after dawn, belly full of broth, limbs slightly less sore, and spirits hovering somewhere between hopeful and please no more hills. The path before you twists through farmland, where dew clings to the wheat and goats eye you with that unnerving, faintly judgmental look only goats have mastered. Your scallop shell taps gently against your side, the familiar rhythm syncing with your steps. You've been carrying the shell for days now, maybe weeks, and while it's become second nature, like the ache in your lower back, you can't help but keep asking yourself, why this shell? Why not a cross, or a tiny statue, or, I don't know, a more aerodynamic rock? Why the scallop? Let's start with the practical side. Here's your mainstream fact. The scallop shell was incredibly useful. In the days before plastic Tupperware or even reliable wooden bowls, a sturdy shell made a perfect travel utensil. Pilgrims used it to scoop water from streams, sip wine at roadside taverns, or beg for stew in monasteries. Some even tied it to their belts, not just as a badge, but as a literal drinking cup. Think of it as the medieval hydro flask, but with fewer color options and more barnacle residue. But of course, like most things in medieval life, utility came wrapped in layers of symbolism. The scallop's fan shape, with its ridged lines all leading to one point, came to represent many roads converging at Santiago. It was poetic, visual, and just the right amount of mystical. It didn't hurt that shells were also associated with baptism, life, death, and rebirth. Basically, this thing could symbolize whatever you needed it to, depending on who was asking. Now here comes your quirky tidbit. Some believed that the shell had protective powers. Yes, medieval people thought the scallop shell could ward off thieves, storms, and even bad luck. One obscure 13th century traveler's tale insists that a shell-wearing pilgrim survived a bandit attack because the robber tripped on a root just as he lunged, and the pilgrim claimed the shell had shifted slightly before it happened. Like a warning from St. James himself, the robber, presumably, had less flattering opinions about the shell. And if you really want to push the limits of shell symbolism, consider this. The scallop is a bivalve. It opens and closes. Some preachers use this as a metaphor for spiritual awakening, saying the true pilgrim must open like the shell to receive grace. You pass a man walking with a limp, using 2 sticks instead of 1. His shell dangles from a piece of cloth wrapped around his chest. He smiles at you, revealing 2 teeth and the weary grin of someone who's been walking far longer than you. The shell, he says, tapping it, reminds me where I'm going. When I forget, it nudges me forward. You nod, say nothing, and keep walking. Because here's the thing no one tells you about pilgrimage. It's a bit like life, only with more blisters. You start out for one reason, faith, guilt, adventure, escape. But somewhere between the swollen ankles and shared bread, it becomes something else. The shell too changes meaning as you go. What once was just a trinket becomes your identity. Historians still argue whether the shell's rise was grassroots, pilgrims adopting it organically, or whether it was a top-down church branding strategy. Some believe the scallop's popularity surged when religious orders began gifting them to pilgrims at Santiago, turning them into official tokens of accomplishment. Others think it spread more informally, like a meme that just happened to be shaped like seafood. Either way, it worked. Soon, the shell wasn't just for Santiago. Pilgrims began using it as a kind of universal ID. If you had the shell, people assumed you were a holy traveler. You got food, shelter, fewer questions, and hopefully fewer highwaymen. But that led to complications. You recall a story told over campfire stew by a German pilgrim with a voice like gravel. He spoke of shell imposters, people who'd never been to Santiago but bought shells and wore them anyway. They'd pretend to be pilgrims to get free meals, to pass through toll roads, to escape certain domestic arrangements back home. One man was found in a village wearing 3 different shells from 3 different shrines. He claimed to be on a multi-faith spiritual crawl. He was not, in fact, very spiritual. But it wasn't always trickery. Some people genuinely longed for pilgrimage but couldn't go. Illness, poverty, danger. For them, the shell became something aspirational, a borrowed holiness, a symbol of where their soul longed to travel, even if their body couldn't. You crest a hill and pause, panting slightly. Ahead is a stone fountain shaped like a lion's head, water trickling from its cracked mouth. You kneel, shell in hand, and use it to sip the cold stream. The water tastes faintly of minerals and something older, stone and moss, maybe. As you drink, you realize something. This moment, this act, is what gives the shell meaning. It's not blessed because a monk handed it to you. It's sacred because you use it, again and again, to drink, to beg, to remind yourself why you're walking. Behind you, a group of children pass on a cart pulled by oxen. One points to your shell and whispers something to his brother. You catch the word peregrino. Pilgrim. You smile and wave. He waves back. Your shell glints in the light. As you set off again, the wind picks up, sending your cloak snapping behind you. The shell dances at your side, tapping out a rhythm older than any map, older than any cathedral. Just you, the road, and the sound of a fan-shaped piece of calcium carbonate reminding the world that you are still. Your knees creak like ship timbers as you descend into yet another village. You've long since given up trying to remember their names. They all blur together now. Stone walls, crooked thatch roofs, and the ever-present scent of boiled cabbage. But this one, at least, has something new. Something unforgettable. At the town square, right in front of a little chapel, stands a group of pilgrims. They're posing for a sketch artist with charcoal-stained fingers and an expression that suggests he regrets every life choice that brought him to this exact moment. The pilgrims beam, proudly displaying their scallop shells, and, wait, one of them is wearing a fur-lined hat with antlers. You blink. No one else seems surprised. This is when you realize something important. Pilgrim fashion, it's absolutely unhinged. You were told to expect modesty, simplicity, ashen cloaks and walking sticks. But somewhere along the road, things got creative, and sometimes straight up bizarre. Let's start with the basics. Here's your mainstream fact. The classic medieval pilgrim usually included a wide-brimmed hat to fend off sun and rain, a long cloak, a satchel, often called a scrip, a walking staff, and, of course, the scallop shell prominently displayed. This kit was functional. It protected you from weather, helped you carry your miserable cheese, and screamed, "I'm holy, not homeless, thank you." But then things escalated. You pass a man with a wooden cross strapped to his back. Not unusual. until you realize the cross is twice his height and appears to be hollowed out for use as a portable bed. Another woman has fashioned a chain of tiny scallop shells and is wearing it like a necklace, clinking musically as she walks. You're not sure whether she's holy or about to summon medieval spirits. And then there are the badges. Oh, the badges. Pilgrim badges were thin pewter tokens pressed with the image of a saint, a shrine, or sometimes the saint doing very odd things, like St. Thomas Becket catching a sword with his forehead. These badges were cheap, widely produced, and proudly worn. Some pinned them to hats, others sewed them along the hem of their cloaks like military medals. One man you saw yesterday had so many he jingled like a wind chime with every step. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some pilgrims collected these badges not just as souvenirs, but as evidence of their spiritual resume. The more badges you had, the more shrines you'd visited, the holier you looked, and presumably, the more free bread you'd get from kindly abbesses. It was like showing up to church with an overloaded backpack of salvation tokens. Oh, you've only done Canterbury? That's cute. I've been to Jerusalem and back, twice. Historians still argue whether these badges were officially encouraged by the church or quietly tolerated. Some religious leaders thought they were frivolous distractions from true devotion. Others recognized the badges as a kind of holy marketing campaign. One sassy bishop even referred to them as tin toys for wandering children. Harsh, but not entirely wrong. And pilgrim fashion didn't stop at accessories. Some pilgrims wore symbolic colors: white for purity, black for mourning, green for new beginnings. Others wore nothing but rags, believing the more pitiful they looked, the more spiritually humble they'd appear. Spoiler: this occasionally backfired when villagers mistook them for bandits or drunkards. There were even full-on costumed pilgrimages. You remember a traveler you met near the Pyrenees, a red-faced Scotsman who claimed his entire village walked to Santiago dressed as the 12 apostles. When asked who got to be Jesus, he just said, "We let the baker decide," and wouldn't elaborate. You smile at the memory, tugging your own cloak closer. It's mud-smeared and smells faintly of goat, but hey, it's warm, and the scallop shell still swings from your belt like a declaration. You've earned it. You pass a roadside shrine where a few pilgrims are gathered. One is sewing a new patch onto his satchel. It's shaped like a fish. Another is dyeing his cloak with crushed berries. A third is carving little stars into the rim of his hat. You watch them, bemused. They're tired, dusty, blistered, and unmistakably themselves. That's the real truth behind the odd pilgrim fashions. They weren't just signs of piety. They were signs of personality. Pilgrims weren't robots marching in unison. They were individuals, each with their own stories, wounds, prayers, and reasons for walking. The shells, the badges, the hats with bells, they were a kind of wearable autobiography. You reach into your satchel and pull out a bit of bread, hard as a monk's conscience, and chew it slowly as you walk. A dog trails behind you, sniffing hopefully. You toss him a crumb. He seems unimpressed, but follows anyway. You dub him Saint Crumb Sniffer. Just ahead, a man walks barefoot, singing in what you think is Latin, but might also be very determined Italian. He wears a shell on his head like a crown. You want to ask why, but he's mid-verse and very committed. Instead, you match his pace for a while, letting the rhythm of the road and the music wash over you. You start to realize that pilgrim fashion wasn't about rules. It was about recognition, a way to spot your people in the crowd. In a world where life was dictated by class, birth, and the unyielding mud of your village, the pilgrim's outfit offered something wild: freedom. For once, you could choose how you looked, who you were, what story your shell told. And as night falls, you join a camp of travelers by a river. You trade stories over lentil stew and share a few quiet laughs. One woman, short, sun-browned, with more shells than sense, tells of a man who turned his cloak into a map. She swears she saw him pull up the hem and point to France stitched in yellow thread. He claimed it helped him stay on course. She claimed he hadn't seen a bath since Avignon. The stars appear one by one as the fire crackles and the roads sleep. You lie back, looking at your shell silhouetted against the glow. It's not just decoration, it's declaration. You are a pilgrim. You are strange. You are holy. You are walking towards something, and this shell is how the world knows it. You wake up under stars that are just beginning to dim, your face chilled and your back vaguely shaped like the uneven patch of earth you slept on. The fire's out. The dog, Saint Crumb Sniffer, is gone, presumably off to pester someone with softer bread. But your shell is still there, tied to your belt, dusty but proud. It's a small thing, but it's become a kind of anchor. You rise slowly, limbs mutinying, and begin walking again. The road hums underfoot, the dawn wind singing softly in your ears. You're still moving west toward Santiago, toward St. James. But now, with each step, you're starting to think more about him. Not the statue in the cathedral, not the apostle in the scriptures, but the man inside the myth. The story they told you when you were young. The one with the stone boat, the talking stars, and the seashells glowing in the dark. You always assumed it was symbolic. Now, after weeks on the road and 3 brushes with trench foot, you're not so sure. Here's your mainstream fact. The legend of St. James's tomb in Galicia really took root in the 9th century. Before that, there were no records of him being in Spain at all. But once his discovery happened, the region exploded with religious fervor. Monasteries were built, kings donated land, Santiago became a rallying cry. During the Christian Reconquista against Muslim-ruled territories in the Iberian Peninsula, suddenly St. James wasn't just an apostle. He was Matamoros, the Moor slayer. His story was adapted to fit politics, faith, and fear all at once. You squint into the rising sun. If James came to Spain, he didn't come quietly. According to the story, after his beheading in Jerusalem, his followers placed his body in a boat made of stone and set it adrift. Divine winds, as opposed to actual navigational skill, carried it all the way across the sea, landing on the Galician coast. There, the locals, pagan then, Christian later, buried him on a hillside. The site was forgotten until Pelayo, a local hermit, followed mysterious lights, sometimes described as stars, sometimes as fireflies the size of coins, to the burial spot. It became known as the Campo de Estrella, Field of Stars, which later morphed into Compostela. Linguistically sketchy, yes. And here comes your quirky tidbit. In the version told by particularly enthusiastic monks, as the stone boat reached shore, a wedding was taking place nearby. The groom's horse got spooked and ran straight into the waves. Both horse and rider vanished beneath the surf. Everyone panicked, until dramatic music cue. They re-emerged moments later, alive and unharmed, their bodies and clothing entirely covered in scallop shells. A miracle, a sign, and also, one assumes, very awkward for the bride. Historians still argue whether the Santiago legend emerged purely from local tradition or was imported and shaped deliberately to create a powerful pilgrimage destination. Some suspect the tomb might not even belong to James at all. It could be the grave of a long-forgotten bishop, or even a pre-Christian chieftain. But once the miracle started, nobody asked too many questions. You climb a slope dotted with lavender and nettles, your feet slipping occasionally on the wet stones. At the top, you find a tiny chapel made of rough granite. A priest sits outside, sipping something from a clay cup. He nods as you approach and gestures to a basin of water. You dip your shell into it, drink, and feel the cool relief slide down your throat. "Long way to go," he says without prompting, his voice more gravel than sound. "But he'll meet you there, he always does." You don't ask who he is, you just nod, because you've heard too many stories now. James appearing in dreams, James turning into a pillar of light, James appearing in battle, sword raised, eyes on fire. You've seen the tapestries, you've heard the singing. One woman swore her son was cured of madness after walking the Camino. Another claimed her goat gave birth to a chicken after praying at James's tomb. You assume something got lost in translation, and always, the shells. The roads, the shrines, the fountains, carved with scallop patterns like ripples in stone. You're walking through an entire landscape that wears its devotion on its sleeve. The chapel priest tells you something else before you leave. In some villages, scallop shells were placed above doors to ward off storms. In others, they were sewn into wedding garments for fertility. The shell, it seems, had become more than a pilgrim's badge. It was a sacred symbol of protection, transformation, and connection to the divine. You thank him and walk on. As you pass a ridge, you see a group of pilgrims clustered around a large stone. Carved into it are 5 lines that curve upward, like the ridges of a shell. Below them, an inscription in Latin, Multe viae unus finis. Many paths, one end. They've left offerings, small bones, coins, bits of broken pottery, and a single sandal. One man kneels with his head against the stone, whispering something between sobs and prayers. His shell hangs from his wrist. You keep your distance. This journey isn't always about talking. Sometimes it's about walking beside people who are hurting in ways you'll never fully understand. You resume your pace. The trail narrows again, trees close in, birds chatter overhead like gossiping nuns. You think about that stone boat, about a man beheaded in Jerusalem and buried at the end of the world, about miracles involving drowning grooms and flaming bugs and fields of stars. You think about your shell, how light it is, and yet how heavy the meaning has become. Whether or not the legend is true almost doesn't matter anymore. You believe in the journey, in what it's doing to you. You believe in the people you've met, the things you've seen, the ways your own soul feels like it's being slowly unfolded, like the fan of a scallop shell. And maybe, just maybe, that's what St. James wanted all along. The days bleed together now. Time on the road is strange, less like a sequence, more like a loop of mud, sun, and soup. You mark your journey not by dates but by aches. The blister on your left heel is yesterday, the sore shoulder 2 monasteries ago, and now, at last, there's a stirring in your chest you haven't dared name. Santiago might actually be near. You reach the edge of a low hill and see the towers of the cathedral in the distance, shadowy, bone-white, reaching like fingers toward heaven. You don't cheer, you don't cry, you just stop walking. It takes a long minute to remember how to breathe without forward motion, and then you descend. As you enter the city, the road widens and changes texture beneath your feet. It's stone now, polished by centuries of footsteps. The scent of incense drifts from unseen chapels, mingling with roasting chaplets and, faintly, the unfortunate tang of communal foot odor. This is Santiago de Compostela. It's less like arriving and more like being absorbed. Pilgrims crowd the square, crying, kneeling, collapsing, laughing, taking off their shoes like warriors after battle. There's a kind of sacred chaos here. Everyone has walked different miles, but all their shells shimmer in the same sunlight. And now the real work begins. Because while the journey was brutal, arriving doesn't mean immediate glory. It means paperwork, lots of it. Here's your mainstream fact. By the 13th century, pilgrims arriving in Santiago were expected to register their presence with the cathedral chapter. Monks documented their names, countries of origin, and route taken. This wasn't just clerical curiosity, it was proof. If you wanted your indulgence, the spiritual pardon for sins, there needed to be a record. After all, heaven may be free, but the medieval church was very big on ledgers. You make your way toward the office of pilgrimage records. It's tucked beside the cathedral, guarded by a man who smells like ink and silently judges your cloak. Inside, monks shuffle parchment and quills like bureaucratic wizards. You fill in your name, though the spelling changes every time someone else writes it down, and offer your shell for inspection. It's real, worn, cracked, approved. You're handed a Compostela, a certificate, written in Latin, ink still wet, testifying that you completed the Camino. You stare at it for a moment. You thought it would feel more dramatic. Fireworks? Heavenly choir? At the very least, a snack? But no, just paper. Damp hands. A stamp that says you did it. You tuck it away. Now comes the indulgence part. You were told, somewhere back in Flanders, that completing the pilgrimage would wipe away all your sins. Full pardon, divine clean slate, but the fine print is thicker than expected. Historians still argue whether the Compostela was initially tied directly to full indulgences or if that came later. Early on, indulgences were more complicated, a mix of pilgrimage, confession, communion, and a bit of luck. By the time you arrive, it's not just about walking. You need to attend Mass. You need to mean it. You may even need to buy a token or make a donation, though no one says that out loud, not directly. So you shuffle into the cathedral with the rest of the pilgrims. It's massive. Columns like trees, candles like stars. The air is thick with prayer and sweat and hope. The tomb of St. James lies beneath the high altar, and people are pressing forward, kneeling, weeping. Some lean their foreheads against the silver casket and whisper things too private for daylight. You kneel too. You rest your palm on the tomb, and for the first time since you started walking, your legs stop aching. Later you attend Mass. The incense swings high on its chain, the botafumeiro they call it, huge and heavy, releasing thick clouds that spiral like blessings into the rafters. The smoke fills your lungs, stings your eyes, coats your skin. You don't cough. You breathe it in like you've earned it. And maybe you have. Afterward, you wander the city in a daze. You pass shops selling scallop shells, rosaries, wax candles shaped like feet for pilgrims praying for foot healing, and plenty of roasted meats. One woman is offering painted badges of St. James, riding a horse and wielding a sword, looking suspiciously like a medieval action figure. You duck into a tavern and collapse onto a bench. A German pilgrim is telling a story about a bear he allegedly outran somewhere in the Basque Mountains. You don't care if it's true. You just laugh, drink weak ale, and clutch your shell. And here's your quirky tidbit for the day. Some pilgrims, upon reaching Santiago, didn't stop. They kept walking to Finisterre, the end of the world, a cliffside town on the westernmost edge of Spain, where the land simply gives up and the sea begins. Pilgrims would burn their old clothes, bathe in the ocean, and toss their shells into the waves. Symbolic purification. Medieval minimalism meets ancient ritual. Some claimed they could see the souls of the dead riding the sunset over the water. You consider it. Maybe you'll go, maybe not. Your feet are staging a rebellion and you've just spotted a man eating soup indoors, which now seems like the highest imaginable luxury. You touch your shell again. It's not glowing, it's not whispering, but it's real. Tomorrow you'll decide your next step, whether to return home, to wander, to start again. But for tonight, you're just a pilgrim, with a full belly, a tattered shell, and a heart slightly less heavy than when you began. And maybe that's all the indulgence you need. It turns out, arriving at Santiago isn't the end of your journey. Not really. You thought it would feel final, like the full stop at the end of a long sentence, but instead it's more like a comma, a pause. Because the road doesn't disappear behind you, it lingers, heavy in your legs, in your shoulders, and the grooves of your soul. And now there's one last journey waiting, the return home. You set out again, this time heading east. The cathedral disappears behind you with surprising speed, the twin towers shrinking like memories you're not quite ready to archive. Your shell sways at your hip. Your steps are slower now, not because of pain, though that's still there, but because there's no great shrine pulling you forward. Just home, and all the questions that live there. But the return is part of the pilgrimage too. You realize this when, just a few days out from Santiago, you pass a funeral procession. A donkey-drawn cart holds a wrapped body, arms folded, a scallop shell resting on its chest. The pilgrims walking alongside it are silent. Some are weeping, others are singing under their breath. This was someone who didn't make it home. Here's your mainstream fact. Many pilgrims died on the way back from Santiago. Disease, exposure, robbery, even just the strain of the road. It could all become too much. Medieval life was already precarious. A pilgrimage added 1,000 new dangers. And so, entire rituals developed around what to do when a pilgrim died far from home. In some places it was tradition to carry the body all the way back to their village. Imagine it, weeks on the road with a loved one packed in linen and prayer, hoping no bridges were out, no rains too heavy. In wealthier cases, bodies were embalmed, or at least salted, and placed in wooden boxes or sealed barrels. In less wealthy cases, well, let's say the prayers had to work overtime. And when returning a body wasn't possible, they were buried on the road. Pilgrim cemeteries sprang up in villages, at monasteries, even on the edges of forests. If a shell was present, it was placed on the body, sometimes pinned to the cloak, sometimes held in the hands, sometimes buried beside the head like a token coin for passage. Not to cross a river, but to cross into grace. You pass one such graveyard now, hidden behind a tangle of olive trees. A low wall of stone encloses crooked markers. At the base of one, you spot a shell, half buried in moss. It's been there a long time, longer than any of the current pilgrims have been walking. You sit by the wall, drinking from your shell, chewing on what might generously be called bread. A passing friar joins you and shares a bit of onion and a story. He tells you of a woman who died just outside Santiago. Her family couldn't afford to bring her body home, so they wrote her name on her shell and nailed it above the monastery gate. For years, pilgrims walked past it and whispered her name, each time carrying her memory a little farther. She walked all the way back, he says, on other people's breath. That stays with you for miles. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In some areas, local churches developed specific mass rituals for proxy pilgrims, living people walking on behalf of the dead. You could quite literally be hired to walk to Santiago with a shell and a name pinned to your cloak. The hope was that St. James would credit the journey to the deceased's soul, granting them the same blessings and indulgences as if they'd made it in person. It's the spiritual version of using someone else's library card, and no one's quite sure if it always worked. Historians still argue whether these proxy pilgrimages were treated with the same respect as personal ones. Some clergy considered them fully valid, others frowned upon them as transactional, but for grieving families who couldn't make the walk themselves, it was hope, a way to believe they could still do right by someone who'd passed. As you walk, the landscape begins to feel familiar again. Not the same fields or villages, but the type: stone fences, distant bells, dogs barking from somewhere you can't see. You begin to wonder what home will feel like when you get there. Will people notice the shell on your cloak? Will they care? You pass through a hamlet where children play with makeshift carts and pilgrims are old news. No one stops to ask where you've been. A man sells boiled eggs and doesn't offer you a discount. You're just another dusty figure on the road. But then, in a quiet church near a crossroads, you pause to light a candle. The priest sees your shell. He smiles. Buen Camino, he says, even though your Camino is ending. It feels like a benediction anyway. You kneel, and something in you, some tight, brittle thing, softens. You didn't die on the road. You didn't turn back. You carried your pain, your doubts, your shell, and you're carrying them home. You reach into your satchel and pull out the Compostela. It's slightly wrinkled now, stained by rain, the ink faded at the corners, but it's yours. And behind it, wrapped in cloth, is the shell. You've taken to holding it less in public, not because it's shameful, but because it's sacred now, something private. On your way out of the church, you notice a young man watching you. He's thin, nervous, and his cloak is too clean. His eyes drift to your satchel, to the faint bump of the shell inside. Is it real? He asks. You nod. He swallows. I start walking tomorrow. You smile. Then I'll carry you for a few miles, just until your feet catch up. And with that, you step into the light, the road stretching behind you but also ahead, because the road never really ends, not for pilgrims. Not for those who carry a scallop shell. The farther you walk from Santiago, the more the shell on your belt begins to change meaning. In towns near the shrine, it was a symbol of arrival, a medal almost. But now, a week's journey east, it becomes something else. A memory, a relic, proof that you were somewhere holy, that you walked with intention. and maybe that you survive something most people never dare to begin. You stop for the night in a town where no one greets you in Latin and no one offers free bread. The world is slowly tilting back toward normal, and your shell, once a kind of passport, is now met with curiosity instead of reverence. "Did you really go?" they ask. "How far?" "Alone?" You answer with a shrug, mostly. Words feel small compared to the path, but as you wander the village square, you begin to notice something odd. The shell is everywhere. Not just on cloaks or belts, but carved into door frames, etched into the stone lintel of a bakery, stamped on the side of a water basin. Above the church altar, a painted fresco shows St. James astride a horse, shell gleaming on his hat like a badge of divine rank. You see now that the shell didn't just belong to pilgrims, it belonged to places. The Camino left imprints on the world around it, not just in mud and memory, but in art, in architecture, in song. Here's your mainstream fact. By the late Middle Ages, the scallop shell had become a common motif in sacred and public art across Europe. Cathedrals on pilgrimage routes carved shells into columns and cloisters. Even those who had never made the journey were surrounded by the symbol, sometimes carved with astonishing detail, sometimes roughly scratched into stone by a mason with more faith than tools. And then there was music. You hear it that evening after Mass, drifting from the back of a tavern where a blind singer plays a bowed fiddle. The lyrics are in Galician, but the melody carries you. It's a pilgrim's ballad, half hymn, half travelogue. It speaks of the road, the pain, the joy, and again the shell appears, in verses, in metaphors, in the gentle swell of the chorus. You join the small crowd seated near the fire. No one looks twice at your shell, but when the final verse ends with the line, "And the sea returned him covered in white stars," you hear someone whisper, "That's the shells, right?" Because here comes your quirky tidbit. Some medieval poets referred to scallop shells as sea stars or the stars of James. They weren't just symbols, they were celestial. The idea caught on, blending myth and map, until the Milky Way itself was called the Way of St. James. To this day, stargazers still trace that trail overhead and call it a mirror of the Camino below. Historians still argue whether this link between stars and shells was purely poetic or based on older pre-Christian beliefs. Some say it was metaphor. Others think it was myth repurposed to support the Santiago legend. Either way, it worked. People believed that the stars showed the way west, just as the shells showed the way back. You start noticing other pilgrim signs too. A house with 2 scallop shells nailed to its shutters, a tiny border of shell patterns stitched into an altar cloth. Even the local pub has a woodcut of St. James behind the counter, raising a goblet with a knowing smirk. The shell is everywhere, woven into daily life like it always belonged there. And perhaps it did. At the village church you notice a stone relief, 3 figures in procession, each carrying staffs and shells, their eyes lifted toward a bearded figure seated beneath an arch. It's crude, clearly local work, but full of heart. You trace the lines with your eyes. This isn't a decoration, it's a memory set in stone, a way of saying, we saw them, we welcomed them, we were part of the road. You think about your own village. Will they carve a shell above your door when you return? Probably not. But maybe your story will ripple out in other ways. Maybe your nephew will ask you what the road was like. Maybe you'll sing a song that's remembered. Maybe someone will borrow your shell some. There's something quietly astonishing about how the shell traveled farther than many of the people who wore it. It found its way into heraldry, coats of arms bearing scalloped patterns to signal pilgrimage pride. Some noble families even used it as proof that their ancestors had walked to Santiago, whether or not they actually had. Let's be honest, some of those ancestors definitely sent servants in their place. You laugh, remembering one particularly round-faced knight who snored through every mass, then bragged about his deep personal connection to the saint. His cloak was covered in shells. You're pretty sure they were glued on. The night is falling now. You sit beneath an elm tree, near the edge of the village, the shell in your palm catching the last golden light. You wonder how many other hands have held a shell like this, how many songs it's heard, how many miles it's traveled. It's not just a keepsake. It's a thread that runs through a continent, a symbol recognized from the mountains of France to the fields of England, from the Rhine Valley to the sunlit coasts of Portugal. No matter where it appears, on stone, in song, or at your hip, it carries the same quiet message. Someone walked. You trace its ridges with your thumb, each line like a road, each groove a story. You're starting to understand why the world held onto it, why the shell became more than a badge, why even now in the quiet, far from the shrine, it still hums with memory. And tomorrow, when you wake, it will keep walking with you. By now, walking has become as natural to you as breathing. You barely notice the soreness, the constant grime, or the way your knees mutter obscenities every time you sit down too long. The scallop shell taps at your side with every step, a rhythm your body has learned to follow like a drumbeat. You've stopped measuring distance in miles and begun counting it in songs, rivers, and just when you're starting to feel like you've seen every pilgrim sight there is, you stumble across a meadow filled with laughing people, shouting, chasing one another, some clearly tipsy, some clearly monks, and you realize, wait, is that a wrestling match? It is. You drop your pack and sit under a tree, grateful for the break and the view. Pilgrims of all shapes and sizes are gathered, cheering and heckling, two red-faced men grappling in the grass, while an old woman bangs a pot with a wooden spoon to keep time. So much for solemn, silent devotion. Here's your mainstream fact. While pilgrimage was absolutely a religious act, it was also a deeply social one. The Camino wasn't just about reaching Santiago, it was about everything that happened along the way. Festivals sprung up along the route to entertain and nourish pilgrims. These weren't dry sermons and quiet reflection circles. They were feasts, songs, games, even plays reenacting saints' lives, often with more flair than accuracy. And when there weren't official festivals, pilgrims made their own fun. Some brought flutes, others carried drums, a few carried reputations. There's a friar near the wrestling pit now, cheerfully explaining the rules. No biting, no invoking saints for strength, and if your pants fall off, you lose. You think that last rule might be a recent addition. A group of younger pilgrims have gathered nearby for what seems to be an impromptu drinking contest. You recognize one of them, a Flemish carpenter who's been trailing you for days. His shell is painted green and tied with string that was clearly once part of someone's undergarments. He raises his mug and shouts, "To St. James, may he forgive me tomorrow." Everyone drinks. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some pilgrims deliberately planned their journeys around village fairs and bathhouses. That's right, medieval spa tourism. Several towns along the Camino offered public bathing facilities, often heated by natural springs. These weren't just for hygiene, they were social centers. Pilgrims bathed, gossiped, flirted, even debated theology while sitting naked in hot water, their scallop shells hanging respectfully on nearby pegs. Some bathhouses even offered joint services, food, music, and bathing. Imagine a medieval combo of a tavern, karaoke bar, and sauna, and somehow it still counted as penance. Historians still argue whether these indulgences in pleasure were accepted parts of the pilgrimage or seen as distractions from the path. Some chroniclers denounce the merriment as sinful, claiming pilgrims were more interested in wine than prayer. Others noted that shared joy, like shared suffering, was a sacred bond. After all, even saints laughed, didn't they? You certainly do, watching a tiny, wiry woman flip a man twice her size onto the ground with a victory yell. The crowd erupts, someone throws bread, someone else proposes a hymn. Everyone sings the chorus badly but enthusiastically. Later, as things quiet down, a storyteller takes center stage. He has a voice like warm cider and begins a tale about a miraculous dog who followed a lost pilgrim all the way to Santiago and back, barking every time the man strayed from the path. The punchline? The dog got his own shell, and pilgrims now pray to San Pero, Saint Dog, for guidance. You're not entirely sure if he's joking. You notice that even in the fun, the scallop shell is ever present. It decorates banners. It's carved into wooden tankards. Some pilgrims have painted theirs, personalizing them with initials, crosses, or crude drawings of St. James. One enterprising soul has attached 3 together like a little clacking wind chime. You decide you rather like this version of the pilgrimage, joyful, messy, holy in a way that has less to do with incense and more to do with spilled wine and shared stories. You talk with a Spanish widow who has walked the Camino 5 times, once for her husband, once for her brother, once for herself, and twice, she says, for reasons too stupid to explain. She pats your shell and says, "Don't keep it too clean. Dirt means it worked." You meet a pair of students walking from Bologna who've composed a 3-part harmony to a medieval hymn, but only remember it after 3 cups of cider. They serenade a group of cows who remain unimpressed. You even encounter a quiet man who wears no shell at all. When asked why, he says simply, "I'm still deciding if I'm going home." You don't press. A fire crackles as night descends, and people lie on blankets or straw, humming, playing dice, or tracing constellations with fingers sticky from roasted chestnuts. You lie back, eyes on the sky. There's the Milky Way again, the way of St. James, and you think of all those ancient travelers who followed it west, chasing salvation and maybe a good story to tell over soup. Your shell glows faintly in the firelight. Tomorrow, you'll walk again, but tonight, you'll remember this: the singing, the wrestling, the laughter. Because pilgrimage isn't just about reaching something sacred. It's about realizing that the sacred often shows up where you least expect it, in muddy fields, in shared songs, in badly translated jokes about holy dogs. And in those moments, you don't just feel like a pilgrim. You feel human. You wake to birdsong and the vague scent of burnt onions, which is either someone's breakfast or a particularly ill-conceived candle. Around you, the meadow-turned campsite is stirring to life. Pilgrims stretching sore backs, someone loudly regretting last night's 4th cup of cider, and one man still asleep with a shell over his face like a very unconvincing sleep mask. You shake off the dreams clinging to your brain and pack up your things. The road beckons again, but today something feels different. the pace is slower. Not just your steps, but everyone's. As if the journey isn't just wearing on the feet, but pressing gently on the soul. Somewhere between fields and forest, you find yourself walking alongside a woman with a short stride and a piercing laugh. Her shell is braided into her belt with colorful ribbons. You nod a greeting, she nods back, and soon you're swapping stories. She tells you she started this journey as a nun. Or maybe she still is, you can't quite tell. She says she left her convent to see what God's wind smelled like outside stone walls. You suspect there's more to the story, but you don't ask. You've learned not to pry on the... You tell her you started because you needed to leave. Because the walls at home felt like they were closing in. Because you made mistakes, or maybe because you didn't, and still no one looked at you the same way after. You don't explain further. You don't have to. Because here's the truth about the Camino that no one puts on the parchment. People walk for more than salvation. They walk for heartbreak, for grief, for escape, for answers, for forgiveness, and sometimes for love. Here's your mainstream fact. Not all pilgrims were chaste, cloaked churchgoers. While the church preached purity, the road made its own rules. Many pilgrims traveled in pairs. Some found companionship, others found romance, and occasionally something more complicated. You pass a pair of pilgrims sitting shoulder to shoulder under an olive tree, heads bent close together. Their laughter is soft, the kind that makes you want to both smile and look away. Their shells dangle side by side, swinging in rhythm. You've heard the whispers, the stories of lovers who met on the Camino and never went home, of affairs carried out in the back rows of cathedrals, of proposals made beneath stars. The line between holiness and hunger is not always clear, especially when you're walking all day, eating one meal, and suddenly the person beside you is both warm and kind, and knows how to apply herbal salve to your blisters without judgment. Cue your quirky tidbit. In 14th century France, one record describes a woman who walked to Santiago with her spiritual companion, a man she called her brother in public and her beloved fellow sinner in private. They wore matching shells. The local bishop was not amused, but they returned home, married quietly, and donated a scallop-carved altar to their village church. It still stands. Love, like pilgrimages, leaves tracks. Historians still argue whether the Camino was pleased for such entanglements or quietly tolerant. Official records insist pilgrims were meant to travel separately, men and women sleeping apart, staying in different sections of hospices. But unofficially, well, even saints have shadows. And it wasn't just romantic love that bloomed on the road. Friendships, the kind forged in mud and prayers and shared bread, often lasted lifetimes. There are tales of pilgrims returning year after year to walk together, letters kept across kingdoms. Some even founded brotherhoods, groups devoted to helping new pilgrims, hosting travelers, or simply remembering the road. You come across a small shrine set into the base of a tree. A wooden plaque, weather-worn but intact, reads, "For Elena. You walked with me until I could walk alone." Below it, a shell tied with faded blue thread. You press your fingers to it, not out of superstition, but respect. Later, at a stream where you stop to wash your feet, a man sits beside you. He doesn't speak for a long time. Then he says, "My wife died 2 years ago. She always wanted to walk here, so I carry her shell." You look at the small white shell dangling from his rosary. It's smooth, clearly never used, a token untouched by the road. You nod, not knowing what to say. Then you untie your own shell, hand it to him, and say, "She walked with me today." His hands shake as he accepts it. And then, in silence, you both wash your feet. You continue your walk, heart heavier and lighter all at once. The path winds into golden fields. The sun is warm, and the breeze carries the scent of thyme. You spot another couple in the distance, walking slowly, their shadows touching. You smile. You think of the woman with the ribbons in her belt. She's long gone now, probably somewhere ahead, or maybe behind, but her laughter lingers. You look at your cloak and realize you haven't sewn anything onto it since Santiago. It's time. You pull a needle from your satchel, a scrap of cloth from your sleeve, and begin stitching a small heart beside your shell. It's crooked, lumpy, definitely not saint-approved, but it's yours. Because the Camino isn't just about saints and sin. It's about the people who walk it with you, the ones who save your place in line, who split their last apple, who sing when your legs give out, who touch your life for a day or a year or forever. And every one of them leaves a mark somewhere between the miles and the memories. Some leave songs, some leave prayers, and some leave shells. The road turns north now, winding through thicker woods and softer hills. The sun filters through oak leaves in golden patches, and the path is lined with moss-covered stones. Your shell is flecked with dust and a smudge of berry juice from a breakfast picked off a generous bush. You can't remember the last time you saw a city. It's just been woods and footpaths and the occasional shouting match over whether a goose counts as livestock or travel companion. But something is shifting. Not in your feet, but in the people around you, because the scallop shell is popping up in places far from Galicia, and not all of them are headed to Santiago. You pause at a crossroads, where a group of travelers rest beneath a painted wooden sign. It points not west, but east, toward Canterbury. And the people here? They're wearing shells too. Your shell, once a clear signal of the Camino, is now just one of many. Some pilgrims wear them shaped like teardrops. Others wear them engraved with words in languages you can't even guess at. A few have shells so small they look more like buttons. One man carries his in a silver frame. Turns out the scallop shell got around. Here's your mainstream fact. While the scallop shell is most famously associated with Santiago de Compostela, it eventually became a widespread symbol of pilgrimage throughout Europe. By the 14th century, people walking to shrines like Canterbury in England, Mont Saint-Michel in France, or even Cologne in Germany, began adopting the shell, sometimes as a tribute to St. James, sometimes simply as a general "I'm holy and tired" badge. You sit near a young English pilgrim who's been scribbling into a travel journal. She tells you about the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, how the faithful flock there to honor the martyred archbishop. "We don't use the shell as much," she says, "but lately it's catching on." She shows you a badge, a pewter depiction of Becket with a stylized shell above his head. "They say the roads are all connected," she adds, "just different names for the same journey." You think about that for a while, the idea that all pilgrimages, all shrines, all prayers and aches and hopes are part of a single great path, one shell, many roads. You continue walking and the landscape subtly shifts. More languages drift on the wind. A few Flemish voices, a Scotsman cursing a tree stump, a Portuguese woman singing a lullaby to herself, and still, scallop shells peeking from bags, tied to boots, stitched onto cloaks. One man walks barefoot, a rosary in one hand and a shell in the other. He wears a broad smile and carries no satchel, only a pouch of dried figs, and what looks like a very heavy sense of purpose. You pass a wayside chapel. Its carvings are local, no St. James here. Just regional saints and symbols of crops, storms and sheep. But above the door, weather-worn and simple, is a shell. You trace it with your fingers. The grooves are faint but clear. Someone passed through here who wanted to be remembered. Or maybe the villagers just wanted to say, "We see you. We know your path. Here comes your quirky tidbit." Some nobles who couldn't or wouldn't go on pilgrimage themselves began using the scallop shell in their coats of arms. That's right, heraldic shells. What started as a badge of humility became a mark of prestige. One English lord, never once having left his estate, had 7 scallop shells on his banner. His enemies nicknamed him Sir James of the Armchair. Historians still argue whether this widespread adoption of the scallop shell diluted its spiritual meaning or made it more universal. Some say it lost its uniqueness. Others believe it evolved, grew into a symbol of longing, not just for Santiago, but for anywhere that made the heart stretch toward something higher. You meet a group of pilgrims near a market town. They're a mix, one heading to Canterbury, one to Rome, and one who simply says, "I go where the road goes." They all wear shells. They all speak of their journey not in terms of destination, but of discovery. That night around the fire, you all share stories. No one asks where you're going next. They just listen, laugh, pass bread. One man pulls a shell from his pocket, polished, carved with his family crest. "I've never been to Santiago," he says, "but I wear it because my father did. He walked it twice. I walk with him now." You nod. You've heard this before, in different forms, but it never stops being beautiful, because the shell is no longer a receipt for visiting a shrine. It's a language. It says, "I walked, I searched, I hoped," and says, "I'm not done yet." It says, "I carry something sacred, even if it's just a memory." As you drift to sleep beneath the stars, the shell resting on your chest, you realize that you're no longer just a pilgrim of Santiago. You're a pilgrim of everywhere. And the shell is your passport, not to a destination, but to a way of being in the world. You walk through morning fog now, a pale gray veil that turns the world into soft shapes and muffled sounds. Trees loom out of the mist like sleepy giants, and the road beneath your feet is slick with dew and memories. Your scallop shell, now faded and chipped, swings with its familiar rhythm. But today, something's different, because somewhere along the way, the road turned modern, not all at once. It began subtly, more gravel, fewer mule carts, and then suddenly a paved stretch of road with painted lines. A bus passes, and you flinch at the speed. A group of hikers wave from the other side of a safety rail, their backpacks gleaming with neon rain covers. One of them has earbuds in. "Welcome to the 21st century pilgrimage." It turns out the scallop shell survived the centuries not just as legend, but as lifestyle. Here's your mainstream fact. The Camino de Santiago was declared a European cultural route by the Council of Europe in 1987 and later recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Since then, the number of modern pilgrims has exploded. Tens of thousands, sometimes over 300,000 per year, walk, bike, and sometimes even drive to Santiago, carrying shells that are now as likely to be clipped to ergonomic rucksacks as to woolen cloak. You step aside to let a cheerful French group pass. They're dressed in ultralight gear, their poles clicking in perfect sync. One of them stops to offer you a chocolate bar and tells you she's live streaming her journey to friends back home. You blink, you say thanks, you accept the chocolate, because, well, chocolate. She points to the shell on your hip. Real one, she says, nodding approvingly. Then she shows you hers, a plastic version, pristine and neon orange, marked with her Instagram handle. You're not sure whether to laugh or sigh. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some pilgrims today have adopted digital shells. That's right, Memoji versions, shell stickers for apps, and even pilgrimage tracking GPS badges shaped like scallops. One website lets you send virtual shells to people across the globe, letting them walk with you in spirit. It's sweet, it's weird, it's very modern. Historians still argue whether this tech-powered wave of pilgrimage keeps the spiritual heart of the journey intact. Some believe it's diluted, the path reduced to hashtags and pedometer goals. Others insist the opposite, that the Camino was always about accessibility, always evolving. If a plastic shell and a fitness app are what leads someone to self-discovery, who are we to scoff? You pass a man seated on a bench, clearly exhausted. He's scrolling on his phone, frowning. When you sit beside him and ask if he's all right, he says, "My booking app canceled my hostel." He then smiles and adds, "But I met 3 great people last night, so I'm just going to follow them today." You nod. The shell he wears is small, carved from olive wood. It's real, and so is the journey. You notice something else too. The shell has become more than just a Camino symbol. It appears in company logos, tattoo designs, even architectural motifs in places far from Spain. You've seen it used for charities, wellness retreats, hiking clubs. There's even a startup called Scallop that sells smart walking shoes. You don't tell them what medieval blisters felt like. And you're still walking, part of the old world, wandering through the new. You meet a pair of pilgrims from Korea. They tell you about the pilgrimage paths forming back home, inspired by the Camino. In Japan, Shikoku's 88 temple pilgrimage mirrors the same spirit. In the United States, long-distance trails are beginning to adopt spiritual framing, modern pilgrimages for the secular soul, someone called them. You smile. The scallop shell has crossed oceans again. In a small town, you stop at a cafe run by a family who've hosted pilgrims for 3 generations. The grandmother remembers when they used to trade soup for stories and stamp parchments with real wax seals. Her grandson now scans QR codes and offers vegan paella. Both of them wear scallop shell pins. The grandmother's is mother of pearl. The grandson's is laser-cut bamboo. You ask her how it feels to see so much change. She says, "The road changes. That's how we know it's alive." Later, you walk past a group of teens dancing on a hilltop. They're making a TikTok video. You cringe reflexively. But then one of them calls out, "Hey, you walked from Santiago, right?" You nod. They run over, wide-eyed, asking questions. How far? How long? Was it hard? One of them sees your battered shell and says, with genuine awe, "That's so cool." You pause and realize they're not making fun. They mean it. They snap a picture with you, grinning, throwing peace signs. one kid balancing your shell on his head like a halo. As they bounce off down the trail, you hear one whisper, "I want to do that someday." The shell is still speaking, just in new accents. That night, you camp near a roadside chapel lit by solar panels. A sign invites pilgrims to scan a code for the evening prayer, available in 5 languages and spoken in the softest, most soothing ASMR voice you've ever heard. You lie back, staring at the stars, the same stars medieval pilgrims once called the Way of St. James. And even though the world is louder, faster, brighter, the road beneath you hasn't vanished. It just keeps unfolding. And the shell, it still leads the way. You're nearly home now. Not just geographically, spiritually. Whatever that means. Your boots are worn through. The scallop shell at your side is chipped, scratched, faded from white to cream, and covered in a lace of dust and memory. It no longer clinks with every step. Now it just rests, quiet, settled, like it's grown into you. You cross the last river on the last bridge. Your own village is not far. The same hills, the same smells of bread and manure and wood smoke. But you've changed. You feel it in your breath, in the way your eyes linger longer on tree branches, how you notice the curve of clouds like they mean something. People stare when you enter the square. Some recognize you, some pretend not to. One child asks if you're a monk. You smile and shake your head. "Just a walker," you say. You're not carrying treasure, no relics, no holy water, just this shell, tied to your belt like a story waiting to be told. Use your mainstream fact. For many pilgrims, returning home was the hardest part. Not because of the physical toll, but because life hadn't waited. Fields still needed plowing. Marriages still needed fixing. People you loved got sick, or distant, or changed. And now you had to fit back into a world that hadn't walked where you had. You visit the church first. It's small, humble. You kneel alone and say nothing. The priest doesn't ask questions. He sees your shell, just nods and lights a candle beside you. You place the shell on the altar, not as an offering, but as a pause. You'll carry it with you again, but for now, it belongs there, among the others, among the whispers and prayers and echoes of feet long gone. Here comes your quirky tidbit. In some towns, returning pilgrims were expected to tell their story publicly, either in the village square or in church, not a sermon, but a kind of oral map of their journey. Some even dramatized it, pantomimes, ballads, poetic recitations. You were expected to inspire, or at least entertain, because people needed to know that the road was real. Historians still argue whether these public pilgrim tales were religious obligation or social ritual. Probably both. Pilgrims were the medieval world's travelers, newsbearers, and mythmakers, and their shells, their credentials. At home, your neighbors ask about the journey. Not all at once, not directly. One by one, they linger after chores or sit beside you at the well. Some ask about St. James. Some ask about the mountains. One boy asks, "Did you see God?" You think about the birdsong in Navarre, the hands that shared bread in silence, the woman with ribbons in her belt, the man who carried 2 shells. And you say, maybe. Later, you hang your cloak by the fire and remove the shell. It feels small now, but not diminished, just distilled, a symbol, no longer weighed down by the miles it's seen, but glowing softly with them. And then, one evening, a knock at your door. It's a stranger, young, nervous, carrying a bag that's clearly too new and boots that haven't been tested yet. "I heard you walked to Santiago," he says. "I want to go. I think I need to." You don't say anything, just step inside, retrieve your shell, and hand it over. It's tradition, you see, passing the shell, letting someone else carry its weight, its meaning, letting the journey begin again. And now you watch him walk down the road you once knew, same path, different steps. You touch your chest where the shell used to hang and realize it's still there, not the object, but because the truth no one told you is this: the scallop shell doesn't just show that you made it to Santiago, it shows that you became a pilgrim, and that never really goes away. And now you're home. The road is behind you, the dust washed away, your pack unpacked. But the sound of the Camino still lingers. Quiet footfalls, soft prayers, the creak of cloaks, the clatter of shared shells in the twilight. The scallop shell might be back on a shelf or sewn into a keepsake bag, but its shape is folded into your bones now. Every curve, every ridge, a memory, a step, a breath you didn't know you were holding. You can still feel the cool wind of Galicia on your skin, the stone under your soles, the smell of a tavern stew shared between strangers who felt like family, just for a night. The world moves on, of course. The harvest comes, the chores return. You pay taxes, you mend things. But something in you stays quieter, more open, more patient. And when you see someone else wearing a shell, on a jacket, in a drawing, tattooed on their wrist, you smile. Because you know what it means to walk for something unseen, to follow a symbol not for its beauty, but for where it leads. And maybe, years from now, someone will ask about that shell, the old one on your wall, or the new one you keep tucked in a drawer, just in case. You'll smile and say, "Oh, that's how I learned to walk slowly." So now, close your eyes, breathe gently. Let the shell go quiet in your mind. The road will always be there, just beyond the hills, waiting with every curve and whispering tree. Sleep well, pilgrim. Tomorrow another journey begins.